Ladies and gentlemen, my name, as he said, is Jodi Vittori. I'm going to be putting the security back at the national security side of this today. I'm going to be talking specifically about how does kleptocracy affect security forces? How does it change our assumptions of how we work with security forces? What are the ramifications of that? Why are these vital national security interests in the United States? And I'm going to throw out some possible policy prescriptions from this, just to get the discussion started today, because we have a 15-minute discussion after, and some of them will be somewhat controversial. To give you a little bit of my background, I'm a former Air Force officer, former intelligence officer, who spent my last years in the military focusing on terrorism finance issues in Iraq and focusing on counter-corruption in Afghanistan. Currently, I teach corruption and governance at Georgetown, and as the slide implies, I teach on dynamics of terrorism and terrorism finance at the National Defense University, but all these ideas are solely my own. All right, couple ideas I want to get out there and change some of the paradigm and narrative of how we talk about security forces when we're dealing with highly kleptocratic governments. And I am going to focus today on highly kleptocratic governments. Some of these will apply to countries that have some kleptocratic tendencies to them, but it may not be full kleptocracies, but I am kind of focusing on our worst of the worst in these sorts of situations. And one of the things to note when we work with countries, whether doing train and assist programs overseas, foreign military sales, et cetera, is we often assume in a country, and indeed our doctrine is set up in a country, that the government and the security forces within that government, whether that be the police, whether that be the military, or I'm going to throw the intelligence forces in this case, also because intelligence forces act a little differently in these countries often. The security forces in these situations, we see them as they, even if the rest of the government is highly corrupt, they must have the national interest at heart. That's our assumptions going into these, that on some level they're there to defend their populace. And there will be units and individuals and forces and so forth who are actually doing that, who are trying to defend their population, who are trying to defend their government and so forth. But when you're dealing with the highest levels of the worst kleptocracies, I would make the argument that the security sector is not going to be an innocent bystander in the kleptocracy itself. As Brad Brooks Rubin pointed out earlier today, as Oscar pointed out in cases in Bosnia, as they noted, your reformers need protection in those environments. You can have the greatest laws and so forth in the world, but if someone comes and is going to shoot or kidnap or otherwise attack those individuals, then your ability to do reform is highly limited. Okay, who are the people who are going to be doing that attacking and shooting and so forth? It can be a variety of security forces writ large. They may be your insurgents, your terrorists, your kind of internationally recognized bad guys. They could be your gray forces, maybe some shadowy private security companies and so forth, but they can also be what are officially your illicit forces, your Geneva Convention carded into forces in the country itself, where we often see, and indeed you cannot run a kleptocracy unless you have a level of impunity and you have the ability to use violent coercion to keep your position of power. Populations do not like their stuff stolen. Stealing from the poor to give to the rich does not go over well in most places. If you're going to do that, you have to have the ability to use coercion, including violent coercion, to do that. So the security forces and the worst of the worst are not an innocent bystander. Again, not necessarily every unit you'll deal with, but on the whole, particularly when you're looking at the elites. To be in the elites of a kleptocratic regime, you have to either have backing of some sort of militant force, officially military forces, or unofficially through some sort of mafia organization or otherwise, or you need to be backed by somebody who does have that backing of a violent force. Okay. And also we forget in the security sector that the key individuals in that security sector may be incentivized for conflict, at least to keep conflict at some level of a low boil, and are going to be highly incentivized not to allow the establishment of rule of law, the establishment of contract enforcement, and so on in these countries. If you are making a lot of money as a highly kleptocratic, elite and highly kleptocratic regime, and you know that all countries have laws against things like drug smuggling and being involved in criminal activity and so forth, and beating up on opponents you shouldn't be beating up on and so forth. The establishment of rule of law threatens your ability as elites in that security force to do that. Often what we see in kleptocratic regimes is that those who are in the kleptocratic regime, in the security forces, the lower levels may be based on some level of merit, maybe not, depends on your force, but the highest levels either are there because of who they know, how much money they've paid, or a combination of both. And when we talk about how much money they've paid, we can be talking about thousands of dollars. We can be talking into multiple millions of dollars to get the positions in those regimes. If you are paying millions of dollars to get a position in a security regime, you are probably not paying those millions of dollars because you want to pay all that money for the good of your nation. Let's face it. You are there because it's a business proposition and you expect to receive that money back along with some sort of reasonable rate of return on top of that. If you don't have those thousands or millions of dollars, there's a good chance that multiple investors have come in and pooled their money together to get you that position. So even if you want to do what's best for your nation overall, you still got to go pay back those investors, and they expect a reasonable rate on their return. And contract enforcement in these environments tend to be rather violent and painful, and so you're going to make sure you do that. We often note in these countries that the militaries are highly, highly inefficient. Some of this will be just the nature of the fragility of the state and perhaps the economy itself, much of that due to the kleptocracy, but some of this will be done on purpose as far as issues like coup-proofing. If you are the leader of that kleptocratic state, you're there for rent-seeking activity. Then you are looking at, you have a very winner-take-all environment. Other people want to take what you have. You need to hold on to that position. So what is common that we'll see in these situations, again, is a variety of militia forces. It is not uncommon to find a substantial force that will be personally responsible to the president or the prime minister or the king, or call your kleptocrat, whatever that particular context is. And these are larger than kind of your typical, Secret Service protecting the president sort of stuff. These are, guys with, strategic level surface to air missiles and fighter jets and, things that the Secret Service in DC here don't run around with. Okay? These are large, tens of thousands of persons military force in their own right. Usually their NCO corps and their lower officer corps will be somewhat merit-based. They will be better equipped, they'll be better trained, and usually their elites who actually run it will be highly tied to the kleptocratic regime itself. Either they're a brother-in-law, they're a cousin, they're a nephew, they're someone they went through the liberation movement with for 30 years or whatever. But you will have that personal core. You see an example of this right now when this goes poorly with what's going on in Zimbabwe as we speak, where the head of the security forces was expected to take over for Mugabe one day. Mugabe demoted him and said his wife was going to take over. The former head of the security forces did not appreciate that demotion, and we see what's going on right now. Okay. You often will have a larger military force that is, it might even be a conscript force, but it's usually poorly paid and poorly equipped. In the case of your private bodyguard force, we call it bodyguard, Republican Guard, special forces, pick your terminology you want to use. Your larger military force will often be those who maybe are from areas that are more of an opposition sort of thing or aren't from the right kind of families. They will get less training, they will get less equipment, they will oftentimes be much more corrupt in that environment. Okay, and this is often done deliberately. So particularly, say, if you have an ethnic environment where the kleptocracy is ethnically based, your Republican Guard unit or your Special Forces unit is going to be that ethnic group or religious group that the leadership comes from, because you want people you trust, as Mugabe is realizing right now. He did coup-proofing really well for many, many decades. He picked the wrong guy, apparently, to make angry. Your larger scale military force would be those that are maybe other ethnic groups or predominantly from other ethnic groups, more minor tribes or whatever this case may be. And then what you'll often see in these environments as well is multiple intelligence services that spend a lot more time spying on each other than actual external enemies, because that, again, playing the intelligence services off one another is part of the coup-proofing process. All right, but we also forget in these environments that the corruption, the kleptocracy itself hollows out that military force. Some of that is deliberate and coup-proofing, but some of it is just the response of what you get in a highly kleptocratic environment. Military budgets are going to be diverted to personal use. Nigeria is probably one of the poster children of this right now. President Buhari of Nigeria there's a series of court cases going on. They have not been adjudicated yet. And of course, you always want to be careful about using corruption to pick on political rivals. But the trial charges are about the fact that in Nigeria, there were about $2 billion in government contracts that were supposed to be procuring goods to go fight Boko Haram. Those contracts were signed, the money was paid, and nothing was ever delivered to the forces who were supposed to be fighting Boko Haram, allegedly. These are still working their way through the courts. That's kind of one of your poster child situations. The budgets and kleptocracies for the military may be 40 or 50% of the budget, but it's still got a limit, and it can still be diverted. Equipment is poor quality equipment. or contracts that never even deliver, like the Nigeria case. Ghost soldiers, you may have soldiers who are officially on the books that don't show up, or you may have entire ghost units. Kate pointed out the Big Spin document, a really great document put out by Transparency International. One of the things they note in the fall of Mosul to ISIS is that you had entire large-scale units around Mosul that didn't actually have troops in them. They only had headquarters units. They officially had troops in them. They were receiving pay and weapons and everything else to have an entire unit. But what they actually only had was a headquarters unit, and they were absconding with the money and stuff through that. And you can't really defend from ISIS with just a headquarters unit and no actual troops. It isn't going to work for you. If someone forgot to brief ISIS that you're supposed to have 2,000 troops and you have 700, it's just not going to go well for you. Anybody who's been a military leader, if you're missing half your troops, this is highly problematic. And we have numerous cases in places where ghost soldiers can be substantial. Parts of Africa and so forth where they've done audits, you can have 40% of your military forces be ghost soldiers. We see media reports from Helmand in Afghanistan. Strangely enough, the number 40% keeps coming up anecdotally. Again, roughly 40% of the soldiers may be ghost soldiers in those locations. And that's before you take into account things like quality of the soldier itself. Again, poor leadership. Leadership gets there by who you know, who you paid off, or both. And your troops know this. They know you're not there because you're a great leader who can motivate people who are going to take the hill and have their interests at heart, that you've paid into taking that command, and they're going to act appropriately as based on that. Okay, why do we care on national security level? These become fatal threats to national security itself in these kleptocratic regimes and the security forces with them. Predatory governments help ignite the kinds of crises we see that become critical threats to the United States. Again, the rise of ISIS after U.S. forces withdrew in 2011 would be one of the poster childs of these situations. And no amount of equipment you put in is going to necessarily fix that problem. In fact, it could very well make it worse, as I'll highlight below. We've spent tremendous amount of money organizing, training, and equipping multiple forces throughout the world. Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Mali. Anybody who likes Ken Burns' histories, there's a lot of this in that new 10-part Vietnam series that's been on PBS on the role of corruption and ghost soldiers and everything else, even in Vietnam. Okay, so as we reevaluate these areas where the U.S. have had large interventions over the years. No amount of equipment, though, is going to fix if you don't have a fundamental force that doesn't have the national ethos at heart. U.S. military assistance can be a contributor to the corruption of their predatory behavior. That new money and resources coming in creates new balances of power in that elite captured government. Who's in charge and who isn't, who's better trained, who's got better weapons, who's got cooler Oakley sunglasses, because that always matters too. Okay. Creates new sources of money and patronage. And even our training can have very detrimental outcomes. If we have a security force that is already highly predatory in its population and is pushing people towards insurgents and terrorists and all those other things due to grievances, and they've been trained by the United States to become more efficiently predatory, and now have an even stronger stake in not having rule of law and a democratic government and a sustainable market economy, we are getting the opposite outcomes of what we're going over there to train and protect in those situations. And as the U.S. ramps up, particularly the Army, with various types of security forces to do train and assist, these are issues that need to be integrated into that. Yeah. So, starting with what should we do about that? I'm going to throw out some possible ideas here to get the discussion going. And I'm going to first talk about getting the United States' house in order. If not a first do no harm level, at least in a first let's mitigate some of that risk level. Okay. So starting with the fact that we don't actually train, teach, have exercise inputs, or anything else. I'm going to focus mostly on DoD because that's where I'm from. I'm not a State Department person. I'm not a USAID person. I'm a former grunt wearing combat boots, so, short, choppy sentences, please deal with me. Okay. I worked with fighter pilots, even worse. So, we need to mainstream this stuff into our doctrine, our policies, our training, our exercise inputs. We don't even teach this stuff to our troops. We don't even have the doctrine to teach them that this is a possibility. Our doctrine assumes that the insurgency we fight are grievance-based and does not take into account the larger, what we call greed or opportunity-based issues or the organized crime issues involved. We don't teach our troops that having a government that doesn't want to legitimate itself as even a possibility, or what our young captains or majors or colonels out there in the field should be doing if they come across it. Who do they report it to? What even is corruption? How do they deal with it? what kind of backing and countermeasures can be taken. We haven't dealt with any of that. You would think after Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq and stuff, we would have started to integrate this, but we haven't. It's not even a requirement in our professional military training courses to have anything on any of this whatsoever. Okay. Establishing DoD points of contact and others. Who do we want to deal with to even set up these sorts of issues? It has not been acknowledged out there. The corruption risk assessments we've talked about before. Understanding the key patronage networks, understanding who's in power, red teaming what happens when we start putting in a bunch of equipment and training and so forth. What do we think is going to happen so that we're not surprised? Doesn't mean that new strange things won't come out of left field, but at least we've kind of thought about the obvious stuff. Okay, and risk mitigation plans. Okay, by definition, when we're going to a fragile kleptocratic state, and we will because there's a strong correlation between conflict and corruption itself, as Kate brought out this morning in her talk. So, when's the last time we had to do a peacekeeping mission in a place like Sweden? It just doesn't happen. Okay, we're always going to borrow from Rumsfeld a little bit, we don't get to pick where we go. We go because there's a national security interest, and by definition, those will often be at least highly corrupt states, if not kleptocratic. So we have to deal with the states as they are going into them. So having a risk assessment and having a risk mitigation plan when we go into there is exceedingly important. And then better transparency in our own contracts, because most of what we do is actually through our contract vehicles, even our train and equip programs. Okay, beneficial ownership requirements we've talked about, anti-corruption clauses, termination clauses, the ability to claw back some of that money that's been given out for corruption in a contract if we find out that's happened. Improve special inspector generals. We have a special inspector general for Afghanistan. We used to have one for Iraq. Where's the current one for our operations in Iraq? Where's the current one for our operations in Syria, Yemen, Sub-Saharan Africa going on right now, or for the money going into Saudi Arabia for the prosecution of the war in Yemen? Where are those special inspector generals? We don't have them right now. Vendor vetting requirements. So not only do you have to have beneficial ownership, but making sure that beneficial ownership is viable and that it's accurate. And then in parallel, not in serial, but in parallel, working with the host states, the kleptocratic state. Much of the same requirements. What we do on ourselves, we should be doing for others. Okay. So we need to be training our troops how to deal with those countries, giving them the ability to monitor and report corruption and how to deal with those corruption issues, requiring those units to be developing independent vetted inspectors general, improving their own internal affairs. Transparency is important, but accountability is also going to be key. Developing parliamentary and civil society oversight and providing protection to those groups. In many countries, they make everything to do with anything to do with national security completely off limits to even ask or report about. Even things like, where are you getting combat boots from and how many for your military forces? There will always be certain information that's national security related, but that should be very minimal and prescribed. Things like contracts for food should not be national security requirements or kept secret. Also makes them a great vehicle for patronage. And then strong procurement, contracting, and budgeting for them as well, under things like the open contract and partnership. All right. With all that, I open it to discussion.